want Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Enemies List. I'm Rick Wilson. Thank you for joining us once again. My guest today is George Stephanopoulos. You know George from, of course, ABC, but you should get to know a tremendous new book he has written called The Situation Room, The Inside Story of the Presidents in Crisis. It is absolutely terrific. I read it over the weekend. And as a guy who came up in national security stuff and in Cold War era stuff, there were things throughout this book that I found absolutely fascinating. So I'm delighted George joined us today. So George, I want to talk to you a little bit about the origin stories of the Situation Room, because we didn't have one until 1961 in its currently sort of incarnated format.
Yeah, I mean, it's changed so much. I mean, when John Kennedy started in 1961, it was really nothing to look at all. Of course, he set it up after the Bay of Pigs, after that disaster, because he was pissed off, as you know, Rick. He was pissed off at the CIA. He was pissed off at the Joint Chiefs. He wanted to set up his own separate information flow into the White House. Right. What's interesting is he actually had the paper on his desk a couple weeks before the Bay of Pigs from his military aide, Godfrey McHugh, one of these larger-than-life characters who actually had dated Jackie Kennedy before she married John F. Kennedy. But he didn't implement it until after the Bay of Pigs. $30,000, 2 weeks. They've slapped it together. It wasn't much to look at. Ironically, Kennedy didn't go there all that much after he set up the Situation Room. In fact, he called it Big Ben. He did draw on the information. Even though in my day, I worked for President Clinton, it still wasn't that sophisticated a room. It was, you talk about the tank at the Pentagon being like a Motel 6 in the Midwest. Right. I consider the original Situation Room kind of a Poconos conference room. But it was still the place where the most consequential decisions were made. Now it's as high tech as it gets. The renovation was finished last August, and it finally looks like it does in the movies.
I had a conversation with somebody who is a recent national security official who said it finally looks like Aaron Sorkin in that room now. It finally looks like what your brain thinks it should look like. It now looks like big screens and connectivity and all that. So let's walk through a little bit about this, because you talk about the Situation Room as this hub in the modern era where presidents and their senior cabinet officials, their national security officials, their intelligence agency heads, they all assemble during moments of crisis. And they don't really ever know what the crisis is going to be in the beginning of their administration. Every president has these externalities and challenges that they seem imponderable in the beginning, and then they seem inevitable once they happen. I mean, I guess one of the great examples of that is 9/11, where, W came in with the idea he was going to be an education president, and then the world flipped over. So talk to us about how the people that run the Situation Room help those senior government officials actually manage these crises, actually understand the things that are in front of them, and build up the ability to have the decisions they need to make.
Well, the professional staff in the Situation Room, the duty officers, who are really the best of the best from across the U.S. government, CIA, DIA, Defense, Homeland Security, State, all the military branches, they staff the watch center of the White House. Right. They're the early warning system for the White House for anything happening anywhere in the world. They also manage all the communications for the president and his staff out to the rest of the world and the rest of the government. As you know from your time, I'm sure, so much of the day-to-day work in the Situation Room is also done by deputies from across the government who grind through problems so that they don't reach the president's desk. Whatever they can solve, they will solve. The ones that make it to the president's desk or make it into the situation room when the president and his team are there are the toughest of the tough problems, the
Sure.
50-50 calls, like, President Obama's decision to take down Osama bin Laden. The intelligence there was a 50-50 proposition, kind of at best, but that's when the president and his team have to deal with it. So in 9/11, what you had was, I think, people acting with incredible valor, just like the firefighters ran towards the World Trade Center when they got the call. You had people situation room duty officers coming from all across Virginia, Maryland, and D.C. to get into the situation room, even if they weren't working that day, even when they knew the White House was a target.
Right.
They were asked to leave 3 times on that day because the White House was being evacuated. Vice President was in the PEOC, the super
PEOC, right,
inside the White House. They were told to leave, but they refused to. And finally, they just had to hand out 3x5 cards, say, write your name and social security number. That was the kill list in case the White House actually was hit on that day.
Yep. I mean, when I was reading that, these duty officers, folks, there was every reason to believe when they walked through that door that day, they might not walk out again. They honestly believed for about half the day, they thought they were all going to be targeted. And a friend of mine at the State Department that day said, I stayed in the building even though we all believed we were all going to die. And I think that, as the White House is a primary target, that courage of these staff members that people don't hear about, these team members that come in, again, they're seconded from across the whole government. Those people on 9/11 and in other moments of crisis have been there sort of as a backstop for the decision making. So I wanted to ask you about some of the moments and the lessons they learned out of the system.
Mm-hmm.
So LBJ kind of used the situation room to manage the Vietnam War. What was the lesson, the takeaway from that, for the national security folks, and for how you use that degree of information that a president can draw upon in that room for good or bad?
I think as I look back over the presidents from Kennedy through Biden, probably the 2 ideal processes were run by President George H.W. Bush, and the way they managed that sweep of revolutions going across the world in 1989, including the fall of the Berlin Wall, which, as Robert Gates said, was in some ways the art of doing nothing. But that was
nothing.
Showing great restraint and one of his favorite words, prudence, in the face of pressure to say and do much more. It turned out to be exactly the right thing to do.
It was,
and of course, quite active in the way that they organized a global coalition for the first Gulf War. I love the phrase that John Bolton used, talking about how the team worked under Brent Scowcroft and President Bush, like the 1927 Yankees. A lot of big stars, a lot of big personalities who were all in the harness at the right moment. What President Obama's process was not that dissimilar as well in the lead up to the takedown of Osama bin Laden. High level people, Hillary Clinton, Robert Gates, Leon Panetta, all with independent careers, but all who had built up a great deal of trust in the prosecution of the war on terror in their early years in the White House. They used to have what they called these counter-terror Tuesdays in the White
Terror
House.
Tuesdays,
where they were taking on the list of all these of all the Al Qaeda terrorists. And I think the lessons that I took away from it, you did need to have extraordinary trust. People had to have extraordinary trust in each other on those teams. The National Security Advisor, like Brent Scowcroft, has to be an absolute honest broker who can manage those teams. There has to be the freedom for the top level people to dissent when necessary. They have to feel that is okay. In some ways, that was missing during George W. Bush's push for the war in Iraq after in the wake of the Bin Laden attack, and that you didn't have enough counter voices that were being heard. You need those three things. And I guess the fourth thing I would say is that in all these cases, and especially in the Obama case of the takedown of Osama bin Laden, you need to have learn the lessons of history. They went to school on the failed in the Iran hostage crisis, the failed Iran rescue mission. Everybody on the team, from Robert Gates through Admiral McRaven, had learned those lessons and absorbed them. And you have to, manage this process of learning the lessons of history, absorbing them without being paralyzed by them. In fact, at one point, Robert Gates, who was so scarred by the Iran rescue mission and was quite reluctant to approve the rescue mission under Osama bin Laden, went to the president and said, hey, maybe my experience here is a negative. Maybe I'm too cautious.
Because he had been Stansfield Turner's deputy during the 1970s. But Bob Gates still has the single best line I've ever heard of anybody. When he finally went to Moscow, he said, now I know what it looks like from the ground. But yeah, no, that's true. And I think, you mentioned Brent Scowcroft, who I had the privilege of knowing. And that I think that the Obama folks sort of did inherit that same methodical, H.W. Bush style, like work the problem, talk to every expert, grind out all the scenarios, the upsides, the downsides, the options. And this is where that sort of people, place, and process, as you write about, all comes together in one moment and one place. And you're right. He had a lot of there were dissenting views inside the room. But at the end of the day, Obama felt like he had sufficient evidence and sufficient ability to execute on the plan. And I think people don't understand that a lot of these guys don't walk in the room knowing everything. They don't walk in the room with a complete picture of everything. And that's why it's such a valuable tool for presidential leadership.
And yet you're never going to have a complete picture. But ideally, if the process is working right, by the time the deputies have gone through everything, at least the options are clarified. They're as sharp as can possibly be. And then, we pay presidents to decide. In the end, that is it. That is really the job. To decide.
That is so true.
That, everything else is can go by the wayside. In the end, it's getting the big decisions right and then communicating them to the country as best you can.
Does the outcome depend on the sort of president's intellectual engagement with the seriousness of the moment? I mean, I look at like what I consider the big outlier of Trump, and you write about that. He wasn't really interested in the questions. He was sort of always in his own head, and even his own aides were like, he's the minute we brief him on something, he's probably going to call a reporter and tell them about it.
Right. Speaker in chief.
How did the professionals manage that moment in time? Because it's you write also about like what these people felt like. What should I be doing on January 6th? I think that's another sort of interesting anecdote. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Well, two responses. First of all, I think the two best examples of how they dealt with it were in the wake of the famous phone call to Zelensky.
Yes.
You basically had every professional on the president's team, every professional in the National Security Council, all of his cabinet officials who were actually trying to implement a supportive policy for Ukraine. The outlier was the president. So on the one hand, you can see why the president felt that they were all, the deep state working against him, because they were implementing the policy that he had laid out. He was the one that abandoned it. January 6th is unlike any, as you know, and you've spoken about it so well and so long, unlike any other day in American history. And I was able to talk to Mike Stiegler, who was the White House duty officer, the Situation Room duty officer on that day. And he tells just a chilling, horrifying story of being in contact with the Secret Service and others on Capitol Hill at moments where they believed they had lost the vice president, where they believed, as he said, people don't understand how close we came to having the vice president murdered, when at the very same time, the president of the United States is sending out tweets attacking the vice president and isn't calling down to the Situation Room once for any information. And think about this, and you know from your time in government what this means, but it startled me when Mike Stiegler first said it, when he said
Mm-hmm.
he started to implement continuity of government
Yeah.
operations. Continuity of government, the executive orders first laid out by Dwight Eisenhower at the height of the Cold
Mm-hmm.
War for how the United States government could survive a nuclear attack had
Right.
been implemented only once before. These are the, setting up secret command centers, figuring out
The
government
the
officials
little evacuation cards and all that.
we all got. It had only been implemented on 9/11, and they started to implement it again on January 6th. It blew my mind when he told me that, because this was something. This isn't dealing with a foreign attack. This isn't dealing with planes coming into the World Trade Center. This isn't dealing with Pearl Harbor. This isn't
Right.
dealing with incoming nuclear missiles. This is an insurrection inspired by the president, and he could care less.
It still strikes me as one of those unbelievably shameful moments for our country that we don't and I was thinking about the interesting parallel. That was a moment where the vice president was, nearly murdered, as you said correctly. And I thought, interestingly, because you also talk about how they responded during the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan.
Yeah.
That was another moment, I think, where there was a sense that we were that the government was sort of spiraling out of control in a moment of chaos and uncertainty. I mean, in that case, it's caused by John Hinckley, a madman. And I was fascinated by how difficult it was in the Reagan era for them to get it back under control. Until my old boss stepped in.
Which one was your boss?
That was HW.
Yes.
Yeah, until he stepped in and sort of calmed the waters and said, this is how we're going to do it. There were like a lot of little competing power centers, Haig and Reagan and everybody else is banging back and forth. And I think some of the transcripts you got that had never been published before, I was riveted by some of those, because that was
what's so interesting about that? It's the way government really works sometimes in moments of chaos. It's just people with imperfect information and clashing egos and not trying to feel their way through a terrible human moment, but also trying to figure out ways to keep the government going. And it is an incredible portrait of Al Haig, who during the Nixon administration, he in the final days was like an assistant president. Some would say he was the acting president, and you could see how that experience inflated him beyond all recognition in the wake of the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan when he's Secretary of State. We all know the moment when he went to the podium and said,
I'm in control here now at the White House.
He's second in command. What startled me was he had actually said that in the meeting that was recorded in the Situation Room before, and it was kind of so transparently stupid that no one even corrected him. Like, it was just like, it's just Al Haig. And had they corrected him, it might have saved him one of the worst moments of his professional career. But he was thinking about, where's the football? Can I get the football? When real serious things are happening, like the Soviets moving their ships closer to our shores and Cap Weinberger taking action to counter that, and Al Haig getting upset because he wasn't told. Well, you were up in the podium,
right? And yeah, I mean, as you reported in this, and this is something that the Russians had 4 boomers, big nuclear submarines, right off the Atlantic coast back at the time, folks, in the bad old days, and one of them was close enough where they would have had about 50 seconds of warning if they had launched, and so. I think they felt an enormous amount of tension and chaos. But it's interesting. You also have another anecdote in there about how the Situation Room and these abilities to reach out to people served America well. For instance, as 9/11 happened, Condoleezza Rice called Vladimir Putin. Condi speaks beautiful Russian, and basically you tell the story about how he agreed to step back a little bit and de-escalate things and to be at that moment, I'm not a Putin fanboy, but at that moment, talk to us about that little story, because I find it fascinating.
I found it fascinating as well. She finally got through to him before she went to the PIAC, before she was with the vice president in the secret control room, and he immediately assured her that he was going to be standing down all of his exercises. And she talks about having the thought, "Wow, maybe the Cold War really is over." One of the things that I tried to then tease out with her and other officials in subsequent administrations, was there a moment when Vladimir Putin turned after that, or was he always the Vladimir Putin we know today and was just doing something provisional and smart in that moment? I end up being, I still don't know the answer to that question. I think he's evolved. I think he's gotten more infatuated and inflamed by the idea of being the last czar of the Russian Empire. But it is remarkable how far he's come from that day in the immediate moments after the 9/11 attack.
Well, George, I want to ask one final question. What was it that led you to write this book? What was it? What inspired you to write this particular book? Because I loved it, and it was, and I also really enjoyed some of the transcripts and the first person material that you dug out in this. It had not really been all that exposed to daylight before, about conversations in the sit room. What was it that inspired you to write the book?
I had not done a book since my White House memoir, which was many years ago, back in 1999, All Too Human. I've been a student of the presidency my whole life. I've covered all the presidents since Clinton, in addition to working in the White House. So I always wanted to do another book. I actually started a couple, threw one aside, and because it wasn't good enough, it didn't feel new enough. And the honest answer is that somebody came to me and said, "How about the Situation Room?" And it like, my head exploded. My only question was, has it been done before? And the truth is, there's never been a popular history. A guy named Michael Bone, who's a former duty officer himself, during your era, during the George H.W. Bush era, wrote a book that came out in the early, in I think 2001 or 2002, much more of a technical book, but nothing since then. And I realized that this could be a way to tell the history of the presidents over the last 60 years, to say something about U.S. foreign policy, and its evolution over the last 60 years, something about the White House. What surprised me and what ended up inspiring me the most was, as we did the work of researching and writing this, having the chance, when we talked to over 100 people, having the chance to talk to these duty officers is what ended up, for me, making the book special. And I think what ends up making the book different, hearing it from their perspective, these anonymous duty officers who, as Mike Stiegler said, serve in silence, sharing their stories for the first time. And, like you, I've been consumed with our politics, covering the politics the last several years, and it can be an enraging, depressing task. And I would do it every morning in my day job, and then put it aside, and then in the afternoon come talk to these patriots who've been serving their country for the last 60 years. And it actually made me feel better about our government. It inspired me in a real way. And that's what, and in the end, I wanted to share their stories.
Well, George, it is a terrific book. I am deeply thankful for you coming on the show today. The book, folks, is The Situation Room by George Stephanopoulos with Lisa Dickey. It is an absolutely riveting read. I burned through it over the weekend, and I flagged the hell out of it, because now I'm going to go and read a bunch of other stuff that cross-references it, because I love a good rabbit hole on national security. Anyway, George, thank you once again for coming on the show. I look forward to seeing you again soon.
Take care.
Thanks. Hey, Democrats, I just want to tell you, please fucking stop it. Okay, there's an article in Politico on Tuesday about Dems in full-blown freakout over Biden. For the love of fucking God, will you fucking stop? Listen, this is a game where you have to hold your cards occasionally close to your chest. If you're worried about it, it doesn't make you look smart or cool or wise to go out and say to reporters, "Oh, we're going to be burned down. Oh, we're doomed. Oh, Trump will win." part of the psychology of the American voter is that they want, while there's a dogfight going on, to see how much fight is in the dog. I'm going to keep teaching you this goddamn lesson because you lack the confidence that God gave normal political operatives. Go out every day and act like Joe Biden is 12 feet tall, covered in steel, brilliant, and has a 12-inch dick, okay? Stop acting like he's a feeble old man. Donald Trump is a criminal who will burn America to the fucking ground. Will you fucking stop with the down-mouth bullshit feeding the New York Times and Politico and everywhere else? If you believe that, fine. If you think that's the case, fine. But for right now, the fact that you all go out and bitch and moan in public about it shows you why Republicans beat your fucking asses way more than you should want. That's why right now you are on the enemy's list. Toughen the fuck up.